Hello and welcome back to class. We are on chapter 13 on social psychology, which is about how other people influence us. Last class, we were talking about conformity, and conformity refers to when we change our behavior, when we act in a way that complies with the expectations of a group of our peers. There isn't necessarily an authority figure who's telling us we must do that. That's obedience. I was trying to look for examples that could be pure conformity or pure obedience, and that was actually really hard to find. There's a famous picture you may have seen before of all these people giving the Nazi Heil Hitler salute. And there's one person there who's defiantly not doing it. His name was August Landmesser. Perhaps you've seen this picture before. And I was wondering, is that conformity or is that obedient? Or the people who are giving the salute, are they conforming or are they obeying? And is August Landmesser not conforming or not obeying and not giving that salute? And it's hard to say, because obviously there'd be strong conformity pressures. That's what everyone's doing. Being a Nazi was the thing to do in, I don't know, 1938. And yet, if you disobeyed, or if you violated expectations, if there were laws that the Nazis put in, passed democratically. If you violated those, you could be in trouble. So it's kind of mixed up. And I was trying to find examples that could be pure conformity without any obedience. And it was challenging because what do I have here? Well, look at this picture of school uniforms. Everyone here is conforming by wearing the same uniform, but there's also obedience there, because that school has a dress code and you have to wear that. In North Korea, you see very, very high levels of conformity. People don't go around with blue hair. There are, 15 approved haircuts for men and women. And yet, is that conformity or is it obedience? Like, what happens if you violate the social expectations in North Korea? Do you start getting watched by the Communist Party? Do you disappear in the night to get interrogated? So then I started thinking, well, what about, are there situations where people freely choose to be in those situations and they follow the norms of the group in order to belong, in order to express the tradition, and they're free, totally free not to do so? And so I was wondering, what about Halloween? Is that pure conformity? When you wear your Halloween costume and you hand out or you get Halloween treats? Maybe that could be an example of conformity rather than obedience. Liam says, no, the kids do it because it's fun. Okay, so they're not being forced to do it. We're complying with the social norm because we want to, we like it. And they get candy. They're rewarded for it. But are they punished for not doing it by an authority figure? Would your parents or teachers get you in trouble for refusing to dress up on Halloween? That was like the best purest conformity example I could come up with. However, sometimes, like, if you don't put candy out, well, what if you get your house egged? But your house isn't being egged by an authority figure, it's being egged by some members of the group who are expressing their displeasure with you. Liam says, okay, so you get weird looks. Yeah, so groups have ways of conveying to us that they are displeased with us when we don't conform. But it's not like a boss making you lose your job. So I was thinking that could be a reasonable example of conformity pressure. And I thought about, what about like religions that people sign up for? What about, rather than ones that say be raised in, or that they can't escape because they're mandated by the law? So voluntary, spiritual, or religious groups. What about a voluntary service or program like Alcoholics Anonymous? Those groups have strong norms, and in order to be in a program like AA, you'd have to follow the norms. Like you couldn't show up drunk and say alcohol is the best. You'd be expected to go along with their norms and values. So I was thinking that those could be examples of conformity pressures. And conformity isn't a good or a bad thing, right? Obedience isn't a good or a bad thing. We would evaluate it as good or bad through some ethical lens. In psychology, at this level, we're just looking at the behavior and trying to understand it. I was wondering about cults. Does anyone recognize these pictures here? These two pictures that I'm showing with my laser pointer. This was famous when I was your age-ish or younger. Phoenix does. What are these pictures of? There's really high conformity in these folks. They're all wearing exactly the same outfits. They all have the same kind of bowl haircuts where they have hair. They all changed their names to sound similar, to end in like Audi. Like one of these people changed their names to Golnaughty, and someone changed their name to Shrotty. So they had their Audi names. They had their identical clothing. They all wore identical Nike Decade black shoes, and after a certain incidents happened, Nike had to discontinue that entire line because it was so infamous. Yes, as Liam says, those are images from the Heaven's Gate cult. This was their leader, Marshall Applewhite. Interesting guy. Probably had a delusional disorder. He thought that an alien spaceship was behind the Hale-Bopp comet. The Hale-Bopp comet comes around the Earth every, I don't know, is it 50 years, something like that? But he thought that basically, if I have this right, Jesus was some kind of an alien. The aliens seeded human life on Earth. They're not happy with the way the project turned out. They're going to come back and just like scrap the experiment, recycle the Earth. So damn, you better not be on the Earth when that would happen, because that would be suicide. But we have a good relationship with the alien overlords, and they're going to rescue some of us on a spaceship. The spaceship is coming behind the Hale-Bopp comet because there were some news articles about something being behind the Hale-Bopp. It looked like there was something behind it. Well, okay, that could be the spaceship. Actually, it was just a star that was in the image. And in order to get on the spaceship, you have to, shed your mortal coil. And there was, is that obedience? He didn't really have coercive power. He wasn't their boss. He wasn't the kind of the head of the community where people can't escape, the way that Jim Jones was in Jonestown. Like, you could not leave Jonestown, and Jim Jones was in charge. When I mentioned Jonestown, that's a 1970s case where there was another very large mass suicide. Jonestown was like 900 people, and Heaven's Gate was about, I think, 37 or so. But you saw super high levels of conformity in the followers, and they followed along until the end. That's probably an example of really unhealthy conformity, but conformity itself isn't good or bad. It depends on the context. And some other examples I thought of as conformity would be, well, like Halloween, maybe Christmas, or other similar holiday traditions. There's a way that most of us celebrate that, right? There's the stereotypical Christmas tree and the Christmas stockings and the Christmas colors. There's a way of doing it that's traditional, and to participate, you conform with the traditions rather than trying to be like Jack Skellington and overturn it all. So maybe conformity could be a good thing if you're keeping up traditions that people enjoy. Some people hate Christmas, and they do it because of these conformity pressures, because of pressures from their family. They don't really want to do it, but they do it anyway. So that could be another example of conformity. But nobody's going to go to jail if they don't celebrate Christmas. Thought of another example. Actually, when I was thinking out loud when I was working on this slide, and my 12-year-old daughter overheard. And she suggested returning your shopping cart as an example of conformity. You're sort of socially expected to do it, and most of us do that, right? We go and put our shopping cart back in the shopping cart return area before we go to our car, and we line it up. Queuing itself, there's no law about standing in line, but we do that very naturally, and we can get quite upset if people break that rule. Well, it's not a rule. If people violate that expectation. And you might feel weird if people interpret the expectations in a way that supports their personal self-interest, like holding the line for their 5 friends, so their 5 friends can come cut the line in front of you. But they're not cutting their line, somebody was holding their place, right? But there's no sort of official rule system and authority who judges the queue and the rules of the queue and what is and isn't cutting. Right? You can't go and appeal that to a judge. There's a comment in the chat from Facienne saying, I was raised in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, and it was one of the worst experiences of Christianity. I'm sorry to hear that. When you're a child, it's, probably at least as much, if not more, obedience than conformity. And because it's what your parents make you do, right? And when you're a child and other people are adults, they are authority figures with more power than you. The textbook introduces its section on obedience by talking about the Stanford prison experiment and the role that de-individuation may have played in it. I am hesitant to attribute the effects of the Stanford prison experiments to de-individuation. So I think a lot of other things might have been going on there as well. But here's kind of the way the textbook makes the segue between conformity and obedience. So conformity is doing what other people suggest you should do, what the group thinks you should do, following expectations. And those expectations often correspond to social roles. Now we have our individual values, our individual identities, our beliefs, and perhaps sometimes we make decisions or take actions that are less about those beliefs, values, personal attributes, and more about the expectations of the group. Maybe there are circumstances, like when people are wearing a mask in a crowd, where a kind of crowd psychology takes over and people are just acting out a role, acting out the role of the angry footballer, and they feel so separated from their personal values and identities that they could do things that were totally inconsistent with their personal values. That's an idea. The critical thinker in me is saying, well, okay, what kind of person shows up for a football riot and wants to go to that? I mean, I feel like certain personalities end up in that situation. But the general idea here is that, if we could mask somebody, if they're all wearing uniforms, if you take away their names, if you give them numbers, maybe the pressure to conform or perhaps to obey would increase. I think that's where they're coming from with this segue. So they talk about the Stanford prison experiment. This was an experiment done in a psychology department where the researchers recruited normal young men to participate in a study of prison life. Here's the original ad. Okay, they'll be paid $15 a day for 1 to 2 weeks. And what the researchers did was randomly assign them. So assign them by chance, not by personality characteristics. Randomly assign them to be either a prisoner or a guard. And then they really dehumanized the prisoners by giving them like numbers. So they're just like referred to by number. And I think this is where the textbook authors are making that connection between de-individuation, because they were referred to by number, but I don't see that as being a very good explanation, because I don't think the guards were referred to by a number. Probably would have been like Guard Smith or something like that. Anyway, they're put into these roles. They have uniforms that reflect their roles. And people started behaving in ways that were determined by the role. The prisoners were seriously mistreated by the guards. So the guards really got into that disciplinarian kind of role. And they were a bit cruel and sadistic, probably do things like make people line up in humiliating ways, maybe stick their head in the toilet, some of those classic junior high physical bully moves. And the situation got so out of hand that the study had to be stopped after 6 days out of concern for the welfare of the prisoners. Now, there are criticisms of the study and its interpretation. What if the behavior wasn't caused by the random assignment to the roles? What if the experimenter had an effect on participants' behavior by communicating that this was the way he wanted them to behave? That's called demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are when the participant in an experiment acts in a way that is suggested for them by the researcher. And the researcher has a vested interest in getting some interesting results and publishing them and maybe becoming famous and getting grant money and getting published. So that's why demand characteristics can be a concern. And in this case, the head researcher played the role of the warden. There have been some difficulties replicating this experiment. It would be super, I mean, you can't ethically replicate it, but there've been attempts at lower grade replications that don't get quite the same results. There's some controversy about the story that's told about the results. People who have gone back to get the original data might say, hey, it's not, you know, telling the kind of clear story that we get in the textbook summaries. Another issue could be selection bias. While there's random assignment to either the prisoner or the guard groups, the study subjects were not a random sample of all humans or a random sample of all young men. And you might wonder, if somebody's looking for something to do for the next 2 weeks, do they want to be living in a university basement full-time, acting out one of these roles? What kind of person would volunteer for that study? Could they be somewhat sadistic or masochistic people to begin with? That's possible. So de-individuation, roles taking over, might account for some of this effect. Maybe, but obviously it's not that clear cut. And what I really don't like about the de-individuation piece is that I don't think the guards were de-individuated, really, if they were still had their names. Okay, they're in uniforms and they've left the rest of their lives behind and upstairs, so maybe could be a bit. It doesn't sit that well with me. What I do notice, though, is dehumanization. Dehumanization of the lower power people in the group, right? Total part of referring to prisoners by number rather than by name is also to dehumanize them. And everywhere that nasty things are done to people, often there's dehumanization of the target. There is a message. Yeah, Josh was saying that maybe somebody that would sign up for this kind of study might be a bit desperate somehow. And if they're desperate for doing it for the money, they're desperate for money, well, why did they get themselves into that situation? Could there be some kind of mental health issue to start with off the bat? You might wonder. But when leaders want to get conformity out of people, they do have a way of putting them into uniforms, don't they? You know, if you want all your students to be very well behaved and prim and proper, maybe you make them wear a uniform. If McDonald's management wants you to be a good cog in the McDonald's machine, well, wear a uniform, right? So maybe there's something to be said for de-individuation of people and in increasing the pressures to conform with the expectation of the social role. I could buy that, even if I didn't buy the entire interpretation of the Stanford prison experiment. Now, just like I've said that conformity isn't good or bad, and obedience isn't good or bad, it depends. It depends on the context and it depends on the outcome, which we evaluate through an ethical lens. Neither, like conformity, neither harmony nor rebellion are good and bad of themselves. Again, it depends. We may easily think that harmony is a positive thing, period. Right? That harmony is good and dissent is bad, because harmony is peaceful and comfortable. That could be a good thing in certain situations. I bet you like harmony at the Christmas dinner table. When groups are making difficult, high-risk decisions, harmony is not as good as you'd think. In fact, the more harmonious the group, the more likely they are to make bad decisions, even catastrophic decisions, through a phenomenon known as groupthink. There are many examples in history where groups of people, working as a team, have made bad decisions. The Challenger explosion comes up. Now, in these cases, none of these cases that I'm aware of have pure horizontality in the group with no power differences. Often when this happens, you have a leader that expects conformity, that wants to be surrounded by yes men. So oftentimes there's somebody that's setting this tone as well. So groups that have this very high harmony might make worse decisions, and they tend to be overconfident in their decisions because they're all saying, oh wow, yeah, that's such a great idea, amazing. So they might overestimate the competence of other people in the group, of themselves. And without anyone there to challenge them, they could walk further and further in error and ultimately into making a bad decision. So table 13 shares some red flags for groupthink. So groups can be overconfident. We're like, yeah, we can do this and we'll do a great job. Well, actually, maybe you can't, maybe you won't. There's a place for humility. I've noticed this in groups that make really bad decisions. Somebody speaking on behalf of the group saying, we all agree, right? As like a statement and an expectation rather than checking for disagreement, than saying something like, who disagrees? And inviting that. In-groups often think of themselves as better than the out groups, as particularly, moral. They might demonize outsiders. So they think of themselves as both perhaps more competent than they really are and more moral than they really are. They might have a kind of team culture where skepticism, where challenging the group isn't welcome. So people feel a pressure to go along. They may, if there is an outgroup that's an enemy, and in addition to demonizing them, they may also underestimate them. And those kind of people who say that, obviously we all agree and we're on the right side, and who set that tone and who sort of shut down dissent could be thought of as mind guards. And when all this goes on, you can have a group of people make a bad decision in the end. And Liam says that's how cults work, and I agree. A lot of these are really basic in-group phenomena, ways that in-groups think of themselves. It can be really hard to challenge your group when you're a member of it, because you want to be liked and accepted. And violating the norms of the group doesn't feel very good. Maybe then they'll gang up on you. But it's important for groups that are making big decisions to think critically. I used to work for the College of Pharmacy at Dalhousie University, and they would have groups of student pharmacists doing analysis of a case and trying to think maybe what's wrong with the patient and what could be the treatment. These are like life and death. These healthcare situations can be life and death for the patient. If somebody is misdiagnosed by a doctor, maybe a pharmacist could catch that. If they are put on the wrong medication, a pharmacist could catch that. If there could be serious interactions, a pharmacist could catch that. And so we wouldn't want groupthink in that kind of a situation. But it was so challenging for people to take on a skeptic role that what we did was actually assigned different group roles every day. So every group needs sort of a chair, a facilitator. That's the role that we can distribute. Every group needs somebody that is a bit of a harmonizer. Every group needs somebody that's an energizer, that gives praise and says, oh, that is a good idea. It makes people feel appreciated. And every group needs somebody in that skeptic role that challenges the group's decisions and gets them to go back and say, are you really sure? And well, what about this? And let's think about that. But the fact that we passed out and mixed up the role cards every day and everyone was getting graded on their skills made that a lot easier for people, because then they knew that, okay, today I'm assigned to the skeptic role and I'm going to show these skills and we're all learning these skills. And then everyone knew that it's not because they were like a kind of cantankerous or difficult person. So there are ways that you can encourage dissent in groups. There's ways that leaders can normalize that. So that an example was that statement that I made before. So instead of saying, well, obviously we all agree that, and that leads people along. What if you say, who disagrees? You don't even have to say, does anyone disagree? Because then the answer could be no. Who disagrees pulls that up a lot more. Right? It invites it. It sort of says that that's welcome. So there's ways that team leaders can make it safe for dissent. Unfortunately, a lot of, if a team leader is motivated by their own, ego, they might not like being challenged, and they might not do that. When people with similar worldviews, similar values get together in a group, there is a tendency for that group to get even more extreme in its values, to get more and more extreme rather than more and more mainline. And that phenomenon is called group polarization. And there's a few reasons for that. So let's say that you have somebody in the group that really identifies with and expresses and models the value of the group. Maybe that person is looked to as a role model, and they are already a little bit more extreme than everyone else. And people start following them, and so the group gets a bit more extreme. And now you have a new norm, but you still need your role model type to keep following, and so maybe that person gets even a bit more extreme, and then people just keep moving in that direction. People who disagree or who don't conform might feel internal and external pressures to leave the group. And once that person leaves, the average psychological profile in the group gets even more extreme than it was before, because the person who is a bit different left. And so you can get to the point of such extremity that from the position of mainstream society, we might say, that group is nuts. That's a cult. What's interesting about cults is that most cult members are not mentally ill. You saw that picture I showed you of the Heaven's Gate followers who are all wearing their black outfits and their identical haircuts. If you look into the histories of those people, they were overwhelmingly normal. Right? One of them was a popular high school student that went on to become an accountant. These are not people that you would think that you would expect to have kill themselves. These are not people who were suicidally depressed. However, they were agreeable to, they were followers of, they adored a leader. And in these situations, it's the leader that has, well, what often looks like symptoms of maybe schizophrenia or something related, like a delusional disorder. The leader thinks that they are some kind of a divine being. And the leader is socially dominant social roles have positions of dominance and submission. The submissives follow the leader, are loyal to the leader, try to please the leader, don't really question or challenge the leader. They do what they're expected to do, and they're somehow rewarded. And they trust the leader. Dominant people set the structure, they define structure, they set expectations, they reward, they punish, right? They are pleased or displeased. And sometimes they decide what's appropriate, what's true, and what's funny. And what's true is true, not because of objective evidence, but because the dominant person says it is. So if you were to go to somewhere like Saudi Arabia or North Korea, people will uncritically accept certain things as true, and they just are true in that society. They're perceived as true. And it's because the leader says so. Phoenix says, I think that's part of why cults are so dangerous. Everyone assumes it could never happen to them. Yeah, so people get drawn into things like this. Maybe they're seeking acceptance. They want to be part of something. Maybe they, haven't found what they're looking for in mainstream society, so they get it there. And yes, very psychologically normal people can get drawn into this. But they would get drawn into it through their sort of submissive side or tendencies. Cult leaders can become very dangerous when they disconnect followers from the outside world. Let's say they don't allow them to talk to outsiders. They don't allow outside information in. So the people who are living on the Jones with Jim Jones, at one point Jim Jones actually left the United States and he took his followers with him to, I think it was Guatemala, and they had a compound there, and they were surrounded by jungle and armed guards. So if you left, you might get shot by the guards or eaten by in the jungle. And he controlled all the sort of media within the compound. So I believe he made radio broadcasts. So they didn't have newspapers coming in from the outside. And so when Jim Jones told his followers that the compound was going to be invaded by American operatives and there was going to be some kind of a bloodbath, he kind of controlled that narrative. That's what they thought was actually true, even though it wasn't true. And so he was able to get them to kill themselves, kill their children. Like the adults started off by giving the cyanide to babies, because this was better than what was going to happen if these American operatives came in. They believed that was the better thing to do. Given an alternative that was actually not true, but they trusted him and they believed him. Cult leaders often seem to have kind of grandiose tendencies as well as delusional tendencies. And if you look at delusional disorders, and they come in certain types, and delusions of grandeur are common, as are delusions of persecution, the idea that someone's out to get you. The textbook says that people can be protected from false beliefs that they might otherwise believe through an inoculation effect. What's that? How does that work? Well, if you tell somebody this belief is wrong, it's stupid and it's wrong, and here's all the evidence against it, actually that might make their mind want to argue back with you and say, oh, but here are all the reasons I reject that and all the reasons why this works. And so this inoculation effect really plays on reverse psychology. So what you could do is actually start off by saying, Well, here's all the reasons you might believe that. And now what are you getting the argumentative part of their mind to do? To start seeing how maybe it doesn't follow and it doesn't add up. Okay, so you sort of start out almost like you were like sympathetic to the belief. And then if you start questioning them, you've already helped with your reverse psychology to prepare somebody's mind for that, because they may have already started thinking about the reasons why not. Any questions about that? It's counterintuitive, because the first thing I want to do when I know somebody believes a lie is just attack it as stupid and wrong. But then the person gets defensive. The textbook mentions brainwashing. Brainwashing isn't defined in the textbook because it's not really a scientific term. It's more of a lay term. There are ways that people are convinced and persuaded. There are persuasion techniques, and people who are in a cult are probably subjected to all of them, and also in a situation where it's difficult, or it's made difficult for them to protect themselves, or for them to question those persuasion techniques, or for anything to interfere with techniques, because you're not even allowed to talk to that questioner over there. Actually, they've been excommunicated and now they're shunned and you can't talk to them anymore. So, as I've mentioned before, obedience refers to doing what an authority figure wants you to do. Often that means there's a power relationship and there's the application of rewards and punishments. And we obey many things all day long. When you drive to school on the correct side of the road and stop at the traffic light, you're obeying the rules of the road. And that's probably a good thing, right? I'm glad that whatever rebellious streak you have, it's not rebelling against the rules of the road, right? And blowing stop signs. But so obedience is kind of a natural way to get through the day. It's a lot less work than going around critically thinking about everything you do all the time. However, mindless obedience can lead people to do some pretty shocking things. There is a famous set of studies in psychology known as the Milgram experiments. Stanley Milgram was thinking about the Holocaust. He was thinking of all the normal, nice Germans that did terrible things or allowed terrible things to happen to his people. I believe his Stanley Milgram's immediate family members were victims of the Holocaust. He's trying to understand this. And he does what turns out to be a landmark study in social psychology. So what he did was he got people to volunteer for a research study. I can't remember if they were recruited through a newspaper and paid like the Stanford prison experiment subjects were, because I feel like if you're hired to do something, then the obedience pressures are probably greater than if you're just volunteering. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's just kind of a thought at the back of my mind. Anyway, so you volunteer for this study, and so does somebody else to your thought. And lots are drawn, and you believe that you were randomly selected to be the teacher in this experiment, which is about the effects of punishment on learning, or the learner. And you think that you're randomly assigned to be the teacher. Actually, it's all rigged. The subject is always the teacher, and the learner is actually what's called a confederate in research studies. It's somebody that's in cahoots with the researcher. It's a research assistant, and they're going to play a role. And what you're supposed to do is this really simple kind of memory task. Maybe you get people to repeat back something that you told them, and if they get the wrong response, you're supposed to give them an electric shock. And there's a panel with different switches, and it goes up to like XXX. We're going to start with a small shock, but you can see that there's a whole range of shocks, and they actually go up to the lethal level. Now, the learner who's getting strapped to this table with this hand-on electric shock plate has some kind of a heart condition. And the question is, let's say this is all rigged. The learner is going to keep making mistakes. How many people do you think would like actually shock them to death, believing that they were really killing this person? Would a normal person do that? Or would that just be like a psychopath that would do something like that? Researchers who were asked this question predicted that normal people would stop after like 150 volts and be like, come on, we're not doing this. Is that what happened? Yeah, some people broke off the experiment and said, I'm not doing this. Some people expressed discomfort, but the very sort of authoritative Yale professor who was the researcher would be like, the experiment must continue. Right, and said that in a sort of authoritative way. It's your job to keep going. It was, the results were shocking. So they even had the learner like screaming, screaming in pain, saying, let me out of here, like pleading to be released. Are people going to keep going? The experiment must continue. It's kind of a little scary to think that almost 70 people would keep shocking past the point that the person is screaming for help and pleading, past the point that the person is no longer responding, so they're presumably dead, and would just keep delivering that shock. Damn, that's shocking. These are shocking results. And Milgram did a series of experiments. There just wasn't one. And he tried varying different factors to see if it would change the rate of experience. And, the greater the distances between the teacher and the learner, the more likely people are to continue. If the person has to actually hold the hand of the learner that's getting shocked, you get a bit less compliance. And you also get more compliance when the researcher, when the director is closer to you giving orders versus giving orders from some faraway place. It wasn't related to any personality characteristics that you might expect, like being sadistic. Right? There were no sex differences. They didn't find cultural differences. One thing that they did find really decrease the level of compliance is that if people will take responsibility, like if you say, and you're responsible if this person has a heart attack, then they won't do it. But the obedience rate actually really increases if the person, let's say you're not administering the shocks, but you're telling some other assistant to do it, so you can step back a bit from the responsibility. And some predictors of disobedience are, higher levels of moral reasoning and being less authoritarian and a bit less agreeable, right? Some people are more likely to disagree and stand up. I've gone up gone a minute over time, so we will return next class to talk about prosocial and antisocial behavior. Thank you for your attention, and I'm here if you have any questions.